She was covered in mud, shaking like a leaf in a hard wind, and she had a wedding veil tangled around one boot when Frederick Easton found her crouched behind his hay bales at past midnight on a Thursday in October of 1882. He had gone to the barn to check on his mare, Belle, who had been restless all evening, stomping and snorting in a way that told him something was not right. Frederick was a practical man, a careful man, and he had learned long ago to trust the instincts of animals before he trusted the words of people. He lifted his oil lantern, and the amber light swept over the familiar shapes of his barn, the stacked bales, the hanging bridles, the worn saddles on their wooden pegs, and then it caught the edge of something white, something that did not belong there at all. He moved closer, slow and steady, the way a man moves when he does not want to startle a creature that might bolt. She was huddled in the narrow space between the last hay bale and the wall, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tight around herself. The wedding dress she wore was a ruin. The bodice was torn at the shoulder, the hem thick with mud and burrs from the prairie grass. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been set in, and it hung in tangled waves past her shoulders. The veil was indeed looped around her left ankle, as though she had forgotten it was there or had simply stopped caring about it somewhere between wherever she had come from and this barn in the middle of the Texas panhandle. Her eyes were open when he found her, large and dark and very, very still. She did not scream. She did not run. She simply looked at him across the flickering space between them, and in those eyes Frederick saw something that he would think about for a long time afterward. Not fear, exactly. It was something more complicated than fear. It was the look of a person who had run out of road and did not know what kind of ground they had landed on. He stood there for a moment, holding the lantern, studying her. Then he said, quietly and without making any move toward her, "I am not going to trouble you. You can stay as long as you need." He set a folded horse blanket near her, within reach but not close enough to crowd her. Then he checked on Belle, gave her a calm hand along the neck and went back to the house. He did not sleep much that night. To understand what it meant that Grace Norris ended up in Frederick Easton's barn on the night of October the 4th, you need to understand what October the 4th was supposed to be. It was supposed to be her wedding day. Grace Norris was 22 years old, and she had grown up in the small cattle town of Harland Creek, about 12 miles northeast of Frederick's property. Her father, Holt Norris, was a man who had built himself up from almost nothing into a moderately prosperous merchant, and he wore that success the way some men wore their Sunday hats, carefully, stiffly, and with great attention to how others perceived it. Her mother, Eleanor, had died of fever when Grace was 14, and since then Grace had kept her father's house, managed his accounts when he was too proud to admit he needed the help, and learned early that the most powerful thing a woman in Harland Creek could do was make herself necessary to the men around her. The man she was supposed to marry was named Clifton Harp, and he was 34 years old, and he owned the biggest ranch between Harland Creek and the New Mexico border. Clifton Harp was the kind of man who was considered a good catch by everyone who did not have to look at him across a supper table every night. He was controlling in the way that some men are controlling, not with raised fists, not at first, but with a slow tightening of expectations, a gradual narrowing of what was considered acceptable, until the woman in his sight found herself unable to breathe without wondering if she was doing it right. Grace had known Clifton was wrong for her from the second month of their courtship, when he had told her, pleasantly enough, that he did not think she needed to be managing her father's accounts anymore, because a woman's mind was not built for numbers. He had said it with a smile, the way he said most things that were meant to diminish her, and she had watched her father nod along because Clifton Harp's money and land made his opinions sound like wisdom. She had tried to talk to her father once, just once. She had sat across from Holt Norris in the kitchen of their house, the one she had kept clean and running for 8 years since her mother died, and she had told him she did not want to marry Clifton Harp. Her father had looked at her with the expression of a man who did not understand why a door he had already decided to open was arguing with him about the hinges. "You are being foolish," he had said. "Clifton is a good man with good prospects. What more do you want?" Grace had not been able to explain it in a way her father would hear. How do you explain to someone that a man who makes you feel small every day is not a good man just because he has never lifted his hand to you? How do you explain that there is more than one way for a person to disappear inside a marriage? Her father had not wanted to hear it, and so she had gone quiet and she had started planning. She had not planned very far. She had a small amount of money she had saved over years, tucked inside the cover of her mother's Bible. She had a pair of practical boots and a wool coat. She had the knowledge that the stage out of Harland Creek ran southeast every Tuesday and Thursday morning, and that if she could get far enough away before anyone thought to look for her, she might have a chance at something different. What she had not planned for was that the roads would be difficult in the dark, that the heel of her dress would catch in a fence gap 2 miles from town and cost her 20 minutes untangling herself, or that the horse she had borrowed from her father's stable, a reliable roan gelding she had ridden since she was 12, would go lame on the rocky ground east of the Easton property and refuse to go another step. She had left the horse on the road, which she felt terrible about, and she had walked, holding her wedding skirts up out of the mud, until she saw the outline of a barn against the dark sky and decided it was shelter enough for one night. She had not counted on anyone finding her. She had not counted on Frederick Easton. Frederick was 30 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who work outside every day, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and hands that were rough from work. He had a quiet kind of face, not handsome in any showy way, but steady and honest-looking, the kind of face that does not surprise you because it shows you exactly what it is. He had been running the Easton Ranch alone since his father died 2 years prior, with only a part-time hand named Cody Briggs to help him during the heavier seasons. He had never been married. He had been close once, or something that felt like close, but the woman in question had gone to Denver with her sister and eventually married a banker there, and Frederick had understood that well enough. There was not much glamour in the life he was offering. There was work, and there was the land, and there was the kind of quiet that either appealed to you or drove you half mad depending on who you were. He had gotten comfortable with solitude, in the way a person gets comfortable with something not because it is what they would have chosen but because they have stopped fighting it. The morning after he found Grace in his barn, Frederick woke early as he always did, built a fire in the kitchen stove, and made enough biscuits for 2 people without really thinking about why he was making twice what he needed. He put a plate on a tray with some of the biscuits, a piece of salt pork, and a tin cup of coffee that had gone only slightly cold. He carried the tray to the barn and set it just inside the door, within easy reach of where he had left the blanket, and then he went about his morning chores without looking directly at the back corner where she was. She was still there. He knew that without looking because Belle was calm, and Belle would not have been calm if something had spooked her in the night. He fed the horses, checked on a section of fence that had been giving him trouble, and came back inside. The tray was not where he had left it. The food was gone. The tin cup was sitting at the edge of the tray, neatly placed, as though someone had drunk from it and then set it down with care. He brought the tray back to the house. He did not say anything, did not check on her, did not do anything that might feel like crowding. He did the same thing the next morning, and the morning after that. On the second day, Cody Briggs came by to help mend the fence line on the south pasture. Cody was 25, sun-weathered and cheerful in the way of young men who have not yet had enough to worry about. He had grown up 2 properties over and had known Frederick since boyhood, which meant he felt entitled to a certain amount of frankness. They were working side by side, pulling wire tight, when Cody glanced toward the barn and said, "Your barn door's been cracked open all morning." "I know it," Frederick said. "You keeping something in there you did not have before." "I am keeping something in there," Frederick said in a tone that closed the subject. Cody looked at him sideways but did not push. He was cheerful, but he was not stupid. It was on the afternoon of the second day that Frederick noticed the wedding dress had been moved, or more precisely, that some of it had been neatly folded and tucked behind the bale near the wall, while a different shape occupied the space. Grace had found an old duster coat that had been hanging on a peg near the tack, and she had put it on over the remains of the dress. He did not acknowledge it. On the third morning, Frederick did something different. He did not just leave the tray. He sat down on an overturned bucket near the middle of the barn, about 10 feet from her corner, and he drank his own coffee there, looking at nothing in particular. He did not look at her corner. He did not speak. He just sat in the quiet way he had about him, while the horses shifted and the barn swallows moved in the rafters, and the early morning light came pale and gold through the gaps in the boards. He sat there for maybe 20 minutes. Then he finished his coffee and went back to work. He was splitting wood outside the barn in the early afternoon, his coat off despite the October chill because the work warmed him quickly, when he heard the barn door creak behind him. He did not turn. He heard footsteps in the dirt, soft and deliberate. He raised the axe and brought it down, clean through the log, and set both halves aside. "I need to know," said a voice behind him, low and careful, as though she was testing whether her own voice still worked. "I need to know if you sent word to Harland Creek." Frederick set the axe down. He turned. It was the first time he had seen her fully in the daylight. Her face was a little hollow from worry, and there were shadows beneath her eyes from not sleeping well, but what struck him first was the directness of her expression. She was not performing calm. She was not trying to be pretty or agreeable or any of the things women were told to be when they needed something from a man. She was simply looking at him and waiting, with the kind of stillness that comes not from passivity but from discipline, from someone who has learned to hold themselves together by an act of will. "No," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Why not?" He considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things. "Because I figured you had a reason for being here that was your own." She said nothing to that. She looked at him a moment longer, and then she looked past him at the wood pile, at the fence line, at the flat expanse of his land under the October sky. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Mostly," he said. "A hand named Cody helps some days." "Does Cody talk to people in town?" "He does," Frederick said, "but he has not seen you, and what he does not know he cannot say." She processed that. Her jaw tightened slightly and then released. "My name is Grace Norris," she said, as though deciding in that moment to tell him something true. "Frederick Easton," he said. She nodded once, the way people nod when they are filing information away. Then she said, "I can work. I'm not asking for charity." "All right," he said, and went back to splitting wood. She stood there for another moment, and then she went back into the barn. But she left the door open behind her, and that, Frederick thought, was something. The arrangement that developed over the next few days was not spoken aloud exactly. It simply grew up between them, like the kind of thing that happens when two practical people occupy a shared space, without fighting each other about it. Grace came out of the barn that evening in the duster coat and with a borrowed pair of Frederick's work trousers that he had left folded near the tray that morning. He had not explained them. She had not thanked him for them, but she was wearing them, and that was that. She came to the house for supper, sat at the table, and ate the beans and cornbread that Frederick had made with the same direct, unhurried manner she had brought to everything. He did not ask her what had happened. He did not ask about the wedding dress or why she had run. There would be time for that or there would not, and it was not his place to pull things out of her that she was not ready to offer. After supper she washed the dishes without being asked, neatly and efficiently, and he dried them, and they stood side by side at the basin in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "I can cook," she said as she was hanging the dish towel, "better than beans and cornbread." "I would not object to that," he said. It was the closest thing to humor she had offered, and he took it carefully, the way you take a small thing that might be fragile. The truth about Grace Norris was that she had never had much room in her life to simply be herself. She had been a daughter, and then a housekeeper, and then a prospective wife, and in each of those roles she had learned to fit herself into the shape that was required of her. She was good at being useful, good at being capable, good at anticipating what was needed and providing it. What she was not good at, what she had almost forgotten how to do, was exist without reference to someone else's needs. Frederick's ranch gave her something she had not expected. It gave her work that was real and necessary, and it asked nothing of her beyond the doing of it. She took over the cooking on the second day she was in the house, and she was, as she had said, considerably better at it than beans and cornbread. She found dried herbs on a shelf that Frederick had never used, and she found onions and carrots in the root cellar that he had grown in his kitchen garden over the summer, and she made a stew that was warm and complicated in a way that the kitchen had not smelled before. Frederick ate it quietly and with evident appreciation, and when he set down his spoon he looked at her across the table and said, "That is the best meal I have had in 2 years." She looked at him to see if he was saying it to be kind, and she decided he was not. Frederick Easton, she was coming to understand, did not say things to be kind. He said things because he meant them, which was either a very simple quality or a very rare one depending on the company you kept. "Your mother taught you?" she asked. "My mother," he said, "believed that coffee and biscuits constituted a full diet. My grandmother on my father's side was the one who could cook. She passed when I was about 12. "I am sorry," Grace said. "She lived well," he said. "She had a good long life." They cleared the table together. It was a small thing, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, making room without instruction, and Grace noticed it only because it was so unlike the careful, watched way she had always existed in rooms with men. She began to sleep in the house on the 4th day. Frederick had cleared out the small room off the parlor that had been used for storage, made up the narrow bed with clean linens without any ceremony, and told her it was there if she wanted it. She did want it. The nights in October in the Texas panhandle were cold, and the barn, for all the warmth of the horses, was not a comfortable place to sleep. The following morning she woke before him and had coffee on the stove by the time he came down, and he accepted the cup she handed him with a nod, and they stood on the porch together in the early light, watching the sky go pink over the flat land, and neither of them said anything for a long time because there was nothing that needed saying. This was the quality that Grace found most disarming about Frederick Easton. He did not fill silence with noise. He did not talk to fill space, or to be heard, or to establish himself. He talked when he had something to say, and the rest of the time he was simply present, which was something so unfamiliar to Grace that it unsettled her before it began to feel like safety. On the 5th day, Cody Briggs came back to help with the horses, and this time he saw Grace in the kitchen doorway, and his face went through several expressions in quick succession before settling on one of deliberate neutrality. Frederick watched Cody from across the yard and gave him a single look that communicated, without ambiguity, that nothing needed to be said or asked. Cody was good-natured and not malicious, and he understood the look. He tipped his hat to Grace and said, "Morning, ma'am," and went about his work, and if he was curious, and he absolutely was, he kept it behind his teeth. That evening, Grace helped Frederick with the horses, and he showed her how he liked them groomed, not because she needed to be told much. She was clearly competent around horses, but because talking about practical things was the easiest way to exist together when more complicated things were waiting in the background. Belle took to Grace immediately, turning her large, dark head toward her and blowing a warm breath against her palm, with the certainty of an animal that has decided someone is trustworthy. "She likes you," Frederick said. "I have always understood horses better than people," Grace said, and there was something in her voice when she said it that was not quite humor and not quite sadness but something in between. "They are more consistent," Frederick said. "They are," she said. She was brushing Belle's coat, long smooth strokes, and she did not look at him when she said, "I was supposed to marry a man named Clifton Harp." Frederick stayed quiet. "He is not a bad man," she said, and then she paused, and he watched her decide that that was not the whole truth. "He is not a violent man." but he is the kind of man who would have turned me into a smaller version of myself, piece by piece, until there was not much left, and I decided that I could not do it. You ran, he said. I ran, she agreed without apology. Did he love you? Frederick asked. She considered that for a long moment. He loved the idea of having someone like me, she said. That is not the same thing. Frederick thought about that. He thought about the difference between loving a person and loving what a person provides, and he thought it was a more important distinction than most people gave it credit for. Your father, he said carefully, arranged it, she said, encouraged it. Would have been furious if he had known I was going to run. She paused again, is probably furious now. Are you worried about him coming after you? I am worried about Clifton coming after me, she said. My father will be embarrassed and angry, but he will not ride out looking for me. Clifton is a different matter. What would he do? Frederick asked. The question was quiet but direct. Grace looked at him then over Belle's back, and the expression on her face was something complicated. He would want to bring me back, she said. Not because he loves me, but because Clifton Harp does not lose what he considers his without an accounting. Frederick absorbed that. He nodded once slowly and went back to checking the latch on the stall door and did not say anything more about it that night. But she noticed that he checked the lock on the front door before he went to bed, and she noticed that the rifle that usually hung above the fireplace was moved to the rack near the door, closer at hand. It was a small thing, but it meant something. Over the days that followed, the shape of their life together, such as it was, took on a kind of rhythm. Grace cooked and managed the kitchen and found herself, by instinct, taking stock of the pantry and the root cellar and making mental lists of what was needed from town. Frederick worked the land, tended the horses, managed the endless small repairs that a working ranch required. In the late afternoons, they often worked alongside each other in a companionable quiet, and in the evenings they sat together on the porch or at the table. And slowly, over those days, they began to talk. Not about the big things at first. About the land, and the horses, and the coming winter, and what the cattle markets were doing, and what books they had read when they had access to books, which in Grace's case was more than Frederick expected, and in Frederick's case was more than Grace expected. He had a shelf of books that surprised her, some history, some natural science, a well-worn copy of Oliver Twist that had belonged to his grandmother, and a collection of maps that he had assembled over years with the careful pleasure of a person who loves geography. She picked up one of the maps one evening, a detailed survey map of the Texas panhandle with hand notations in the margins, and he showed her the features he had marked: the creek lines, the grazing land, the route the cattle drives had taken before the railroads changed everything. You love this land, she said. I do, he said, without embarrassment. Why? She asked because the land out here seemed, to the eye, flat and unforgiving and stubborn, and she wanted to know what someone else saw in it. Frederick thought about it the way he thought about things, carefully and without hurry. It is honest, he said. It does not pretend to be something it is not, and it gives back what you put into it. Not always right away and not always in the way you expected, but it does give back. Grace turned the map over in her hands and thought that she had heard a lot of words in her life, and that this was one of the truest collections of them she had come across. On the 8th day, a rider came to the property. Frederick saw him first from the fence line where he was working, a solitary figure on a gray horse coming along the road from the direction of Harland Creek. He watched the rider for a moment, then he set down his tools and walked to the house, and he said to Grace, who was at the kitchen window, "There is a rider coming from the direction of town." She moved immediately, the way a person moves when they have been expecting something. She came away from the window and went to the side of the room that was not visible from the front of the house, and she said very quietly, "Can you see who it is?" "Not yet," he said. "Stay inside." He went to the porch and waited. The rider came close enough and Frederick recognized him after another moment. It was not Clifton Harp. It was a boy of about 16, one of the Halstead boys from the other side of Harland Creek, who occasionally ran errands for various people in town. Frederick met him at the edge of the yard. The boy was a little out of breath and his horse was lathered. "Mr. Easton," the boy said, "Mr. Norris in town is asking around about a runaway horse. Gray Roan says it belongs to him. Went lame out on the East Road. You seen anything like that?" "I found a lame roan on the East Road about a week ago," Frederick said, which was true. He had found the horse the morning after Grace arrived, brought it in, and had been resting it in his pasture. "It is in my south pasture, recovering well. Tell Mr. Norris he can send someone to collect it when he wants." "Yes, sir," the boy said. He also said, if anybody's seen his daughter Grace, to say he wants her home and there will be no trouble. "I will keep an eye out," Frederick said, which was not a lie, and he waited until the boy turned and rode back before he went into the house. Grace was standing just inside the door. She had heard most of it through the window. "He says there will be no trouble," she said, and the tone of her voice was dry as dust. "Do you believe him?" Frederick asked. "About being reasonable once I am back in his house with Clifton standing next to him, no," she said. "Do you believe him?" "I believe he does not want a scene," Frederick said, "and I believe Clifton Harp is letting your father do the looking because it is more convenient for him." "Clifton would think it beneath him to come looking himself," Grace said. "At least at first." She pressed her lips together, thinking. "But eventually he will come himself. He is not a patient man." "Then we should have a plan," Frederick said. "What kind of plan?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her steadily. Then he said, "You could go north. There is a town called Meadow Ford about 40 miles up on the stage road. The stage runs through there twice a week going west. You could get to New Mexico or Colorado and start over." Grace looked at him. The afternoon light was slanting through the window and it lay across her face, and she was perfectly still and very serious. "You want me to go?" she said. It was not accusing, it was asking. "I want you to be safe," he said. "That is not the same thing." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she looked away at the window, at the flat land outside it, at something Frederick could not see. "And if I do not want to go?" she said. The room was very quiet. "Then you do not go," he said. Those 5 words landed in the space between them with a weight that neither of them commented on. Grace turned back from the window and met his eyes, and what she saw in his face, the steadiness of it, the quietness, the complete and utter lack of performance, did something to her chest that she did not have a name for yet. "I do not want to go," she said. "All right," he said. He made coffee. She sat at the table and watched him do it, and neither of them addressed what had just been decided, but both of them knew that something had been. In the days after that, something between them shifted in a way that was perceptible, and yet impossible to point to exactly. It was in the way Frederick began to tell her things about himself without her asking, small things: the history of the land, stories about his father and grandmother, the name of the creek that ran through the east corner of his property, the fact that he had once ridden all the way to San Antonio on a dare when he was 19, and regretted nothing about it except the return journey. It was in the way Grace began to laugh occasionally, a real laugh, not polite and not performed, the laugh of a person who has been offered something genuinely funny and allows it to reach them. Her laugh was low and quick and surprised-sounding, as though she kept catching herself off guard with it. It was in the evenings, when they sat on the porch and the sky over the panhandle went that particular shade of orange and violet that no painter had ever quite captured, and they were easy in each other's company in a way that had to have grown from something real, because it was too specific and too particular to be anything else. One evening, about 2 weeks in, Cody Briggs came for supper. He had been invited. Frederick had told Grace that morning, and she had made something considerably more elaborate than usual, which Cody ate with the reverence of a man who had been living on his own indifferent cooking for too long. Afterward, over coffee, Cody was more talkative than Frederick, which was not difficult, and he told stories about the county, who was buying land, who was feuding with whom, what the cattle market had been doing since the railroad cut through the county seat. And then he said, carefully, watching Grace's face, "Word in town is that Clifton Harp is planning to ride out this way soon. He has been asking around about properties on the East Road." The room went quiet, Grace's hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "When?" Frederick said. "Maybe a week," Cody said. "Maybe less, depending on how patient he is." Frederick nodded. He looked at Grace and she looked at him, and a whole conversation happened in that look that neither of them had to speak aloud. Something needed to be settled, and settled before Clifton Harp rode up to this property and made it complicated. After Cody left, they sat on the porch for a while in the dark, and the stars were extraordinary over the open panhandle, the kind of stars you can only see when there is no town light to wash them out. A coyote called from somewhere across the flat land, and another answered far away. "What are you thinking?" Grace asked. "I am thinking that I have something I want to say to you," Frederick said, "and I am trying to find the order of it." She waited. She was good at waiting. "I was not looking for anything," he said. "I want you to know that. I was not lonely in the way that makes a man careless with his judgment. I am telling you that so you know what I am about to say is not coming from need." Grace turned her head slightly toward him. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not because of Harp, not because of your father. Stay because I want you here." "I have been trying to decide if I should say that or not, and I decided I should because you deserve to know that when you are making whatever decision you are going to make." The coyote called again, distant and clear. Grace was quiet for a long time, long enough that a less steady man might have started to fill the silence with qualifications and apologies. Frederick did not. He waited. "You barely know me," she said. "I know you well enough," he said. "What do you know?" she asked, and it was not a challenge. It was a genuine question. A woman who had spent most of her life being told what she was by other people, asking a man who had watched her quietly for 2 weeks what he had actually seen. Frederick thought about it in his careful way. "I know that you are the most capable person who has ever walked through this house," he said. "I know you are honest in a way that is not always easy. I know you love horses. I know that when you laugh, you surprise yourself with it, and that is one of the most interesting things I have ever noticed about a person. I know that you made a decision that took real courage, and you made it alone, and you did not fall apart when it put you in a stranger's barn with nowhere else to go." He paused. "And I know that you have been sitting beside me on this porch for 2 weeks, and I have not yet run out of things to think about where you are concerned." Grace looked at him for a long moment in the dark. "Frederick," she said, "you do not have to say anything back," he said. "I am not asking for anything tonight. I just needed you to know." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "I am not sure what I feel because I have spent so long feeling only what was expected of me that I am not always sure which things inside me are mine." "That seems fair," he said. "But I think," she said slowly, picking her words with the care of someone who has not been able to trust her own voice for a long time, "that the reason I did not want to go north to Meadow Ford is not only because of the land or the safety of it." Frederick was very still. "I think it is partly because of you," she said. The night was quiet and enormous around them, and the stars were very bright, and neither of them moved, and that was enough for now. What Grace did not fully account for was that Clifton Harp was less patient than Cody Briggs had estimated. He came not in a week but in 4 days, and he did not come alone. Grace was in the barn with Belle when she heard the horses. She came to the barn door and looked out across the yard and saw 3 riders coming up the road at a pace that was fast enough to mean business. She recognized Clifton immediately. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, dark-haired, with the kind of bearing that had always reminded her of a man who expected doors to open before he reached them. Beside him were 2 of his ranch hands, both of them wearing their work clothes and their expressions closed and deliberate. Frederick had been at the south fence, but he had heard the horses too, and he was already in the yard when Clifton rode in, standing at the edge of the porch with his arms loose at his sides. Grace came out of the barn. "Grace." Clifton's voice when he saw her was carefully even, which was the most dangerous register he had. "Come here." "Mr. Harp," Frederick said. Clifton looked at him the way powerful men look at obstacles. "This is between me and my intended bride, friend. I would appreciate you stepping aside." "This is my property," Frederick said, still easy, still quiet. "You are welcome to speak your piece from where you are." Clifton's jaw tightened. He looked at Grace again, and now there was an edge in his expression that she recognized, the edge that came when Clifton Harp felt that something was not going the way he had determined it should. "Grace, we have an arrangement," he said. "I understand you were frightened and you made a rash choice. I am willing to put that behind us and start again properly." "No," Grace said. The single word was clear and quiet, and there was nothing uncertain about it. Clifton looked at her as though she had done something technically impossible. "I beg your pardon. I said no," she said. "I am not going back to Harlan Creek, and I am not marrying you. I am sorry for the trouble I caused on the day, and I am sorry if I embarrassed you, but I am not going to change my answer." "You are embarrassing yourself," Clifton said, and now his voice had dropped into something colder. "You are standing in a stranger's yard in men's clothing, and you are telling me no. Do you understand what people will say about you, Mr. Harp?" Frederick's voice was still quiet, but there was a quality to it now that had not been there before, something under the surface like bedrock. "The lady has given you her answer. She is here of her own free will, she is comfortable, and she is not asking for your assistance. I think it would be better for everyone if you turned around." One of Clifton's hands moved to make his horse step forward, but Clifton stilled him with a small gesture. Clifton was a calculating man, and what he was doing right now was calculating. He was calculating Frederick's stillness, the rifle visible through the open front door of the house, the fact that this was clearly a man who was not going to move or raise his voice or make any dramatic gesture, which meant he was also not going to back down. He was calculating that if he pushed this further in this place, it would become a different kind of trouble than the kind he had planned for. "This is not finished," Clifton said, looking at Grace. "Yes, it is," she said. Clifton held her gaze for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned his horse and his two men followed him, and they rode back down the road, and the dust settled slowly behind them. Grace stood in the yard and waited until they were out of sight. Then she let out a long, slow breath. She turned to look at Frederick. He was watching the road, still with his arms loose, still with that quality of unhurried steadiness that she had come to understand was not detachment but rather the opposite, a man so settled in himself that he did not need anything external to prop him up. "He will go to my father," she said. "Probably," Frederick agreed, "and my father will be furious." "Also probably," she looked at him. "You are not worried." "I am concerned," he said. "But I am not worried in the way that changes what I intend to do." "What do you intend to do?" she asked. He turned from the road and looked at her, and the afternoon sun was behind him and his expression was open and direct, and without any pretense at all. "I intend to ask your father for permission to court you properly," he said. "If you are agreeable to it. And if Harp has already beaten me there, then I intend to make my case anyway, and let your father decide between a man who is trying to bring you back against your will and a man who is asking for the chance to offer you something better." Grace stared at him. "You are going to ride to Harlan Creek," she said. "With your permission," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something welling up in her that she recognized now, had been recognizing for days, the specific warmth of a feeling she had not let herself believe in for a long time because the people around her had kept telling her it was less important than practicality and position and what the town would say. "Frederick," she said. "Yes." "You do not need my father's permission," she said. "I am 22 years old, not 16. I will not wait on my father's opinion of you." A very slight smile crossed his face, quick and warm and real. "Well," he said, "I would still like to make the trip if it is all the same to you. I would rather have Harlan Creek behind us cleanly than have it following you around for the rest of your life." She considered this and found that she respected it. "All right," she said, "but I am going with you." He looked at her. "It is my life they are arguing about," she said. "I would like to be in the room." After a beat, he said, "I would not have it any other way." They rode into Harlan Creek 2 days later. which gave Frederick time to see to the ranch's most immediate needs and gave Grace time to locate. Among the things Frederick had been quietly gathering for her since her arrival, a needle and thread procured from his cousin's wife who lived 10 miles south, a length of muslin, a borrowed blouse that was only a little too large, something presentable enough to wear without embarrassment. The town was smaller than Grace remembered it looking when she had left it running in the dark, or rather not smaller but more detailed, the way places look when you return to them with a different frame of mind. The general store, the blacksmith, the hotel and saloon on the main street, the church at the north end. People on the wooden sidewalks who recognized Grace and whose expressions shifted into something between surprise and avid curiosity as she rode through on a horse alongside a man they did not know. Holt Norris was in his store when they arrived. He was a lean man of 53, with gray in his mustache and the tight wound expression of someone who had been waiting in a state of contained anger for 11 days and was now presented with an object for that anger. "Grace," he said, and the way he said it contained an entire sermon. "Papa," she said, "this is Frederick Easton. He has his ranch on the East Road. You know his land." Holt Norris looked at Frederick with the thorough, assessing look of a man who is deciding where to direct blame. "So it was your barn," he said. "It was my barn," Frederick said evenly. "And your daughter was treated with complete respect while she was in my care." "She was not in your care," Holt said. "She was trespassing." "Papa," Grace said, and there was a quiet firmness in her voice that surprised her father. She could see it in the slight shift of his expression. "I came to talk to you about my situation, and I would like you to listen. Not as a merchant who is embarrassed by a disrupted business arrangement. As my father." Holt Norris looked at his daughter for a long moment. He looked at the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes, and something in the line of his shoulders shifted slightly, like a man who has been ready for a fight and is not sure the fight is available to him. "Close up the front," he said to the boy who worked behind the counter, "and go find something to do elsewhere." They sat in the back room of the store, among the crates and the smell of sawdust and dried goods, and Grace talked. She talked about Clifton Harp, about the specific and calculated way he diminished her, about the narrowing of possibility she had felt in his company, about the fact that she had tried to tell her father before and had not been heard. She talked about it clearly and without dramatics, and she watched her father's face move through its various resistant stages and come out on the other side of them into something that looked, cautiously, like listening. When she finished, there was a silence. Then Holt Norris looked at Frederick Easton, seated beside his daughter, and said, "You are asking to court my daughter." "I am," Frederick said, "with the acknowledgement that Grace herself has already made clear she does not require your approval and that I respect her for that. But I would like to have it anyway if you are willing to give it." Holt was quiet. He was looking at this man who had arrived in his store without apology or aggression, who had spoken plainly and without performance, and he was a merchant, and merchants, even ones blinded by ego, understand value. "Clifton Harp came here yesterday," Holt said. "I expected he would," Frederick said. "He wants Grace back." "I expect that too," Frederick said. "The question is what you want." Holt Norris looked at his daughter. Grace was looking back at him, and in her face he saw something he recognized from her mother's face, a long time ago, when a leaner had looked at him in the early days, before life had put its weight on both of them. He saw a person who knew her own mind and intended to live according to it, and the question was whether he was going to stand in the road or get out of the way. He let out a breath. "I will speak to Clifton," he said. "I will tell him the arrangement is finished." Grace felt the knot in her chest loosen, slowly. "And you," Holt said, looking at Frederick with the specific severity of a father who is trying to maintain some authority in a situation that has largely escaped his control. "I know the Easton land. It is good land, well managed. I will make inquiries about your character." "I would expect nothing less," Frederick said. Holt nodded. It was not gracious exactly, and it was not warm, but it was real, and it was a start. Outside the store, in the thin October sunlight, Grace stood on the wooden sidewalk and looked at Frederick and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something that was not relief exactly but was adjacent to it, a loosening of a tightness she had carried for so long she had begun to think it was simply part of her. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She looked at him, at his quiet face and his steady eyes, and she said, "Thank you for going in there with me." "I would not have stayed outside," he said. She laughed, the quick, surprised laugh that she kept catching herself at, and he smiled, the real one that changed his whole face, and they stood on the sidewalk in Harland Creek with the October wind pushing at them and the town moving around them. And it was the most ordinary moment in the world and the most extraordinary one she had experienced in years. There was still the matter of Clifton Harp to resolve, and it was resolved not with drama, but with the slow, grinding machinery of a man, realizing that the leverage he believed he had was not what he thought it was. Holt Norris, once he had committed to a position, was stubborn enough to hold it, and he made it clear to Clifton that the engagement was ended, and that any attempt to intimidate or pursue Grace would be answered legally. Clifton was not a man to take consequences lightly, but he was also, at the core of him, a man of business, and an ugly legal and social scene served none of his interests. He made a scene privately, and then he did not make another one publicly, and gradually the matter settled into the category of things that had happened and were over. Harland Creek talked, because Harland Creek always talked, and it said various things about Grace Norris for a few weeks, and then it found other things to talk about, which is what towns do, and the talk faded. Frederick courted Grace with the same unhurried sincerity with which he did everything. He rode to town twice a week, and they walked along the main street or sat on the steps of her father's house, and he brought her things occasionally, not flowers, which would have wilted on the ride out, but a book he had found at the trading post that he thought she would like, a length of blue ribbon that matched a color he had heard her say she favored once, a jar of her favorite tea that he had tracked down at the dry goods store in the county seat, because she had mentioned in passing that she had not been able to find any for months. He was attentive in the specific and observant way of someone who actually listens, and Grace, who had spent years perfecting the art of being listened to selectively and incompletely, found this so novel that it repeatedly caught her off guard. In November, he asked her if she would walk with him after supper, and they walked out along the edge of town to where the land opened up and the stars were beginning and the wind was cold and clear. He stopped and he turned to face her and he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me, Grace, if you are willing." She looked at him. "I am not going to tell you what your life will look like," he said. "I cannot promise you ease or certainty. I can promise you that I will listen to you and I will not try to make you smaller. I will not make decisions about your life without talking to you first. I will not look at you and see a position to be filled. I will look at you and see you." The wind moved through the grass around them. "That," Grace said very quietly, "is the most significant thing anyone has ever said to me." "Is it enough?" he asked. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, and he was very still under her touch, and she said, "Yes." He covered her hand with his, and they stood there in the cold November night with the stars enormous overhead, and then he kissed her, gently and without hurry, the way he did everything, and Grace felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in December of 1882, in the church at the north end of Harland Creek, in a ceremony that was small but properly attended. Holt Norris gave his daughter away with a stiffness that softened, by the end of it, into something that resembled pride. Cody Briggs stood with Frederick in the front of the church in a clean suit that he was clearly not comfortable in, and his discomfort was so evident and so cheerful that it made the ceremony feel warmer. Grace wore a dress of deep green wool, not white. She had made that decision deliberately and with a certain quiet satisfaction, and she wore her hair up with small cream-colored flowers tucked in at the sides. Frederick had cleaned up in a way that surprised Cody, who had not known his employer owned a suit, and he stood at the front of the church with the same steadiness he brought to everything, watching Grace walk toward him with an expression on his face that was so open and unguarded that several women in the pews had to look at their hands for a moment. When the preacher asked him, Frederick said, "I do," in the same clear, unhesitating voice he used for everything true. When Grace said it, it was the most certain she had felt in all her 22 years. The winter settled in around the Easton ranch after the wedding, deep and white and clean, and they settled in with it. There was a particular quality to those months that Grace would remember for the rest of her life, not the hardship, because there was plenty of that. The work of keeping a ranch running in a Texas panhandle winter was not light, but the specific texture of those early months together. They learned each other's habits. Frederick rose earlier than she did but started coffee for her before he went out, and when she came down, the kitchen was warm and the cup was waiting. Grace learned that he had a tendency to become absorbed in a task to the point of forgetting to eat, and she began timing meals to the rough schedule of his work so that he came in and found something ready rather than having to remind himself to stop. He learned that she read late into the night, and he moved a better lamp into the parlor without comment. She learned that he carried a small worry about the south fence line in a way that she could recognize in his expression even when he did not say it, and she began asking about it directly so he could talk through it, because talking through practical problems made him easier in himself. They disagreed occasionally, as real people do, about money and about plans, and once, significantly, about whether to take on a second hand for the spring season, which Grace thought was necessary and Frederick thought was an expense they could avoid. They argued about it plainly and without cruelty, and Grace was so good at the numbers that she eventually showed him, on paper, precisely why she was right. And Frederick looked at the paper and looked at her and said, "I believe you are correct," without any apparent difficulty in saying it, and hired the second hand in the spring. His name was Denny Archer, 28, and he was a solid worker with a quiet nature, and he and Cody Briggs got along well enough, and the spring cattle work went better than it had in 2 years. In the spring of 1883, Grace discovered she was expecting, and she told Frederick on a Sunday afternoon in April when the land was beginning to show green and the sky had finally gone fully warm. She told him in the kitchen directly, because she did not know how else to do anything, and he went very still for a moment in the way he went still when something was reaching him deeply. And then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her in a way that was firm and warm, and said everything that words would have been inadequate for. Their son was born in November of 1883, in the same room where Grace had been married, the bedroom of the Easton house that Frederick had expanded over the summer because Grace had gently and practically pointed out that they would need the space. The birth was attended by Mrs. Connolly, the midwife from Harland Creek, a capable woman in her 50s who had brought a considerable portion of the county into the world, and who took no nonsense from anyone, including, when necessary, the mother. The baby was healthy and loud, with Frederick's dark hair and Grace's dark eyes, and they named him James, after Frederick's father, and Grace held him in the lamplight while Frederick sat on the edge of the bed beside her, with a look on his face that she kept in some specific part of her memory for as long as she lived. Holt Norris came to visit in December, ostensibly to see the baby, and he was awkward in the way of men who are not used to being wrong about things, and are slowly being forced to admit that they were. Grace watched her father hold his grandson with the careful, slightly panicked expression of someone holding something very precious and very fragile, and she felt something in her chest ease toward him that had been knotted there for years. "He is a fine baby," Holt said, which was as close to an apology as he was going to get. "He is," Grace agreed. "Easton is a good man," Holt said. "I know," Grace said. She looked at her father and said gently, "I knew before you did." Holt had the decency to look a little ashamed of himself, and then he laughed, a short, surprised laugh that was so much like Grace's laugh that both of them noticed it, and the afternoon became warmer after that. The years that followed were not without their trials, because no life in the Texas Panhandle in the 1880s was without its trials. There was a drought in the summer of 1885 that hit the grazing land hard, and Frederick and Grace sat at the kitchen table on more than one occasion with the ledger books between them and worked through it carefully, making decisions that were sometimes difficult but always shared. There was a winter illness that went through the property in 1886, felling Frederick first, and then Cody, and then even little James. And Grace ran the household on almost no sleep for 3 weeks, keeping broth warm and fires built, and watching everyone else slowly come back to themselves, with the steady focus of a woman who does not allow herself the luxury of panic. When Frederick was recovered enough to come downstairs and find Grace at the kitchen table, pale and hollow-eyed and finally still because everything was over, he sat beside her and took her hands and said, "When did you last sleep?" "I am not sure," she said honestly. "Go to bed," he said. "The baby." "I have him," Frederick said. "Go to bed, Grace." She looked at him and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this was what she had run toward without knowing it, not just safety, not just kindness, but someone who saw when she was carrying something too heavy and stepped in to carry part of it. That was what no one in Harland Creek had been able to explain to her when she tried to articulate what was wrong with Clifton Harp. Not the diminishment, not the control, but the aloneness of it. The way a life with the wrong person can make you lonelier than being alone. She went to bed, and she slept for 11 hours, and when she woke, Frederick had made stew, which was not as good as hers, and James was sitting on the kitchen floor very happily, and the world was all right. In 1887, when James was 3 and already running everywhere with the fearless industry of a boy who has learned to walk on the wide open ground of a working ranch, Grace discovered she was expecting again. She told Frederick in the same kitchen, in the same direct way, and he responded in almost the same way he had the first time: the stillness, the quiet crossing of the room, the arms around her that said everything. Their daughter came in the spring of 1888, and they named her Eleanor after Grace's mother. She arrived in April, when the land was at its most optimistic, and she had Grace's dark hair and Frederick's steady eyes, and she was, from the first hour, a person of pronounced opinions who communicated them clearly, which made everyone who knew Grace Norris laugh. By 1889, the Easton Ranch had become something substantial. Frederick had taken on the adjacent parcel of land when the neighboring property went up for sale, and with the additional grazing acreage, they had been able to expand the herd considerably. Cody Briggs had become a permanent fixture, having never quite managed to establish himself anywhere else, and he was good at his work and loyal in the way that good men are loyal, and he had become, over the years, something that could reasonably be called family. Denny Archer had moved on, as hands do, but he sent word at Christmas, which Frederick and Grace both thought was a fine thing. James Easton grew up knowing how to ride by the time he was 5, how to help with the lighter fence work by 7, and how to read by the time he was 4, because his mother had sat with him every evening with a book and an oil lamp, and a patience that was both absolute and exacting. Eleanor Easton grew up knowing how to be in a room and how to be a force in it, which Grace watched with a profound and sometimes humorous recognition. The barn where it had all begun was still standing, older and a little more weathered, patched in a few places where the wood had given way. Grace passed it every day going to see to the horses, and she thought about it sometimes. The night she had crouched behind the hay bales in a ruined wedding dress, covered in mud, not speaking, not knowing what she had landed in. She had not spoken for 3 days. When she finally did, he had already decided. She knew that now in a way she had not known it then, because she had asked him once, years into their marriage, lying in the dark of their room with the October wind outside and James asleep down the hall, "What did you decide that first night?" And Frederick had been quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was being careful to be true. "I decided that whoever you were worth protecting," he said. "That was what I decided. I did not know yet what else it would become. But that was where it started." "And when did it become something else?" she asked. "When you asked me if I had sent word to Harlan Creek," he said, "the way you asked. Like someone who needed the answer to be no and was not going to fall apart if it was yes. I decided something different then." "What?" "That you were one of the most remarkable people I had ever met," he said simply, "and that I intended to pay attention." She had laughed in the dark, the quick surprised laugh, and he had pulled her closer and she had rested her head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady as everything else about him. And the wind was cold outside and the house was warm inside, and James was asleep down the hall and a leaner would wake them both too early in the morning. And Grace Norris Easton lay in the dark of her own life and thought that if you had told her, crouching behind those hay bales in a ruined dress, that this was where the road she was running on led, she would not have believed you. She believed it now. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, Frederick and Grace sat on the porch of the Easton house in the December cold, wrapped in blankets, with coffee in their hands, and the sky doing its particular winter thing of going very deep and very dark and very full of stars. James was inside with Cody, playing some kind of card game that James was almost certainly winning because he had inherited his mother's head for numbers, and Alina was asleep in her room, having gone to bed with the authority of someone who had decided she was tired and that the decision was final. 7 years, Grace said. 7 years, Frederick agreed. She looked at him. The lamplight from the window fell across his face, and he was older than he had been, and she was older than she had been, and the land around them was the same honest, unadorned, stubborn land it had always been. "Are you glad," she asked, "that you went to check on your horse that night?" He turned his head and looked at her with the full, unhurried attention that had never once in 7 years made her feel like a burden. "Every day," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the cold December dark with the stars burning above the panhandle and the sounds of their children inside, and the horses settled in the barn and the land stretching out around them in all directions, wide and honest, and full of everything they had made of it together. The barn where a runaway bride had hidden in the hay still stood, solid and patched and real, a testament to the particular night in 1882 when a woman had run out of road, and a man had carried a lantern into the dark and decided without knowing it yet that whatever came through his barn door was worth every single thing that followed. Far in the distance, a coyote called. Another answered, and the night settled around the Easton ranch like a hand placed gently on a shoulder, warm and sure, and everything was, at last, entirely as it should be. In the years that came after, Harlan Creek would grow, as all the small towns of the Texas Panhandle grew in those years, pushed by the railroad and the cattle trade and the slow, relentless press of settlement. New faces arrived, new buildings went up, new stories started, and some of them ended well and some of them did not, because that is what life is. But the Easton Ranch persisted through all of it, through the dry years and the good years, through the town's expansions and its contractions, through the turning of the decade into the 1890s, and the changing of the world around them. Grace Norris had arrived in the Texas Panhandle in a ruined wedding dress on a night in October with nothing but the clothes on her back, a few dollars in her boot, and the specific courage of a woman who had decided that her life was hers to direct or it was nothing at all. She had built something from that decision, something real and lasting and hers. James Easton grew into a serious young man with his mother's directness and his father's patience, and by the time he was a teenager he was, by general agreement, one of the most capable hands on the property, which his father acknowledged with a quiet pride that he expressed mostly through giving James more responsibility, which was the highest compliment Frederick Easton knew how to pay. Eleanor Easton grew into a young woman of such clear opinion and capable energy that Grace sometimes caught herself watching her daughter across the kitchen with a feeling of recognition, so strong it was almost vertigo. "You were like her," Frederick told Grace once, watching Eleanor systematically reorganize the pantry shelving at the age of 9 because she had decided the current arrangement was inefficient. "Were," Grace had said, and he had laughed, which was one of the best sounds she knew. Cody Briggs eventually married, in the spring of 1891, a woman from the county seat named Martha who had come west to teach at the new school, and who was, in Cody's words, the most organized human being he had ever encountered, which in Frederick's private opinion was probably what Cody needed. The wedding was held at the Easton Ranch because it had the most practical space, and Grace cooked for 3 days beforehand, and the children ran themselves nearly to collapse in the yard, and it was a good day. Holt Norris's health began to fail in 1893, and Grace made the ride to Harland Creek frequently that year, staying sometimes for several days to manage his household and keep him comfortable, and Frederick kept the ranch and the children running in her absence with the steady competence that had always been at the center of him. Holt Norris died in the autumn of 1893, and he died knowing his daughter was well and that he had been wrong about her life, which Grace had made sure of, not because she needed him to say it, but because she thought he needed to be at peace with it, and she loved him even in his stubbornness, and she wanted him to go in peace. She stood at his grave in the church cemetery in Harland Creek with Frederick beside her and her children on either side, James 9 years old and solemn in a way that made him look suddenly older, Eleanor 5 and holding Grace's hand with a grip that was both fierce and gentle, and she said goodbye to her father in the October wind, and it was hard, and it was real, and she was not alone. She was never alone. A third child came in 1894. A boy they named William, after Frederick's maternal grandfather, and William arrived into the world with all the energy of someone who had been impatient to get there, and intended to make up for lost time, and the ranch absorbed him as it had absorbed everything with room and warmth and endless sky. The Easton house expanded over the years the way a living thing expands, not all at once but in measured additions that responded to need. Another bedroom when William came, a wider porch because they sat on it so often, a proper study for Grace when it became clear that she had opinions about the county agricultural cooperative and intended to express them in writing to the relevant parties, which she did, and which occasionally had effect, and which she considered a reasonable use of an evening. By the turn of the century, Frederick and Grace Easton were in their late 40s, which in the Texas panhandle meant they had seen enough weather and enough seasons, and enough of the particular grind of agricultural life to know what they were made of. What they were made of was considerable. The ranch was prosperous. The children were healthy and educated, and all 3 of them possessed of the quality that Grace had once struggled to claim for herself, the certainty that their own minds and hearts were worth listening to. She had given them that, she and Frederick together. It was the thing she was most proud of. On an evening late in the autumn, when the leaves were going and the sky was the color that the Texas sky turns in October, that deep burning blue that sits above the gold and brown of the plains, Grace Easton walked out to the barn alone. She did it sometimes when she wanted to think, when she wanted to be in the specific quality of quiet that only a barn has, the warm, dark smell of animals and hay and old wood. She ran her hand along the wall at the back, near the last hay bale. The barn had been rebuilt mostly over the years. The boards were different. The hay bales were in a different configuration. But the sense of the place was the same, the particular quality of shelter it offered to whatever needed sheltering. She stood there for a moment in the lamplight, 38 years old, in boots and work clothes, with flour on her hands from the baking she had been doing before she came out, and she thought about the girl who had crouched here in a ruined white dress and did not speak for 3 days because she had run out of everything except the stubborn fact of herself. She thought about Frederick coming in with the lantern, the amber light, the steadiness of him, the way he had set down the blanket without crowding her and gone back to the house. She thought about 3 days of silence. She thought about the way her voice had felt when she finally used it, testing the ground. She thought about the look on his face, that night on the porch 7 years after the wedding when she had asked him what he had decided, and he had said simply that he had decided she was worth protecting. It was, when she thought about it, the most complete and truest answer to everything. The barn door opened behind her, and she turned, and Frederick stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind him, looking at her with the quiet, direct attention that he had been giving her since the night she arrived in his hay. "Supper is ready," he said. "I know," she said. "I am coming." "Are you all right?" he asked, in the particular way he had of asking it, which always meant he already suspected the answer was yes and was just making sure. "I am," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She looked at him across the barn, at the man who had carried a lantern in the dark and found her, and said, quietly and without making any move toward her, that he was not going to trouble her and that she could stay as long as she needed. "About how strange it is," she said, "that the worst night of my life turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." Frederick held her gaze, and a slow, warm smile crossed his face, the real one, the one that changed everything about him, and he said, "Come in out of the cold, Grace." She crossed the barn and walked out into the October evening beside him, and he took her hand, and they walked back to the house together through the clear, cold air, toward the lamplight in the windows and the sound of their children's voices and the life they had made, wide and solid and unequivocally their own. Behind them, the barn stood in the dark as it always had, patient and weathered, full of warmth in the winter and shade in the summer, keeping whatever needed keeping. And the stars came out over the Texas panhandle, one and then many and then all of them at once, the way they always did, honest and enormous, asking nothing and offering everything, exactly like the land, exactly like the life, exactly like the love that had found its beginning in a hay bale and an oil lantern and a man who said, without knowing yet what it would cost or what it would give, "You can stay as long as you need."